the moment the ground disappears. What if one morning, without warning, the ground beneath everything you believe simply vanished? Not physically, but existentially. Imagine waking up to find that your sense of right and wrong, your idea of good and evil, even your deepest understanding of purpose and truth were not eternal laws of the universe, but borrowed stories. Inherited myths, comforting illusions that once stitched meaning into your life, now torn apart by a single sentence, God is dead. When Friedrich Nietzsche wrote those words, he wasn't just confronting religion. He was warning us about a future that would come crashing toward us. A future where the moral compass would shatter, where the lights of meaning would dim, where we'd be forced to walk without a map through a landscape of silence. And that future is now. Today, we find ourselves suspended in an invisible crisis. Technology expands. Information multiplies. Yet inside, more people than ever feel lost, anxious, hollow. We've never been more free yet. So what happens when meaning dies and nothing is left to take its place? Can we survive that kind of freedom, or does it devour us? This is not just a philosophical question. It's personal. Because at some point in life, every one of us will feel the ground shift. A divorce, a death, a betrayal, a silent moment when everything we trusted crumbles, and we're left staring into the dark. That is the abyss Nietzsche spoke of. And in this video, we're going to step inside it. But we won't stop there. Because Nietzsche didn't leave us in despair, he left us a challenge. A path. A brutal, beautiful invitation to become something more. Something unbreakable. So stay with me. Because by the end of this journey, your understanding of life, truth, and who you must become will never be the same. God is dead, and we killed him. He didn't shout it. He whispered it, like someone speaking over a grave. God is dead. Not a declaration of rebellion. Not an atheist's triumph, but a lament. A funeral bell tolling not just for religion, but for an entire way of being. These were the words Nietzsche inscribed in The Gay Science in 1882. And if we truly understood them, we'd feel their weight like thunder pressing against the soul. You see, Nietzsche wasn't trying to disprove the existence of God. He wasn't interested in childish debates about whether heaven exists or not. He was pointing to something far more terrifying, the quiet death of belief itself. Not because someone killed God, but because we did. Through centuries of rationalism, skepticism, and the modern obsession with facts and proof, we dismantled the sacred myth that once gave our ancestors purpose. Science explained what religion once did. Telescopes replaced prayers. Equations replaced rituals. The divine, once etched into the stars and the soil, was now reduced to data. And so, without meaning to, humanity drained the spiritual marrow from the bones of life. Not with cruelty, but with curiosity. Not with hatred, but with indifference. We simply moved on. And in doing so, we killed the very source of the meaning we now crave. But Nietzsche's warning wasn't about God's disappearance. It was about the aftermath. Because when the divine framework collapses, everything that was built on top of it, morality, justice, love, duty, starts to tremble. Imagine demolishing the foundation of a house while still living inside it. The structure groans. The walls crack. Eventually, everything falls. And that's where we are now. Not in celebration, but in ruins. For thousands of years, people believed in a divine plan. That suffering had meaning. That justice had an eternal witness. That goodness would be rewarded and evil punished. But what happens when there is no longer anyone watching? No cosmic order. No transcendent truth. Only us, alone in the dark. The horror is not that God might not be real. The horror is that he was once real in our minds and now he is gone. And Nietzsche knew that vacuum would not stay empty. That void would pull at the soul. The death of God wasn't the end of religion. It was the beginning of nihilism. The beginning of people trying to live without meaning. But before we explore that abyss, we must face a darker question still. What do you do when freedom becomes too heavy to carry? The weight of freedom. When a person loses everything they depended on: belief, tradition, a moral compass, what's left is not peace. It's pressure. An unbearable pressure to now define life for oneself, with no map, no script, no higher voice to point the way. And this, Nietzsche warned, is the true curse hidden behind the phrase "God is dead." Because when you are no longer told what is right and what is true, you must decide it yourself. And for many, that freedom is too much to bear. It sounds paradoxical. Shouldn't freedom liberate us? Shouldn't the absence of rules and dogma open the door to a richer, more authentic life? In theory, yes. But in practice, most people are not prepared for the psychological storm that follows. Without a divine guide or sacred code, we are thrown into what Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom, the sense that everything is possible, but nothing feels real. The modern mind has inherited this tension. We are free in ways our ancestors could never imagine. Free to believe or disbelieve. Free to choose a path or wander endlessly. But this freedom does not come with instructions. It comes with the silence of the void. And when the mind confronts that silence, a crisis begins. A slow unraveling. What we once called meaning begins to feel arbitrary. Morality starts to look like opinion. Truth seems slippery. And purpose, what purpose? We are told to find ourselves. But where, exactly, should we look? This is not a philosophical game. It's a daily psychological battle. Every time you feel paralyzed by choice, or restless despite comfort, or quietly panicked when things seem too quiet, that's the weight of freedom pressing down on you. Jung called this the confrontation with the self. When the outer frameworks collapse, the ego has no choice but to face the unconscious, and in that moment, either it evolves or it begins to fracture. Nietzsche saw this long before it became common. He knew that modernity would free us externally while imprisoning us internally. Because without sacred anchors, the soul drifts. And that drifting opens the door to something far darker than disbelief. It opens the door to nihilism, the belief that nothing matters at all. But before we fall into that abyss, ask yourself this: are we truly free? Or are we simply unmoored, cut loose from tradition, but still afraid to build something of our own? The shadow of nihilism. When the old gods fall silent and the sacred texts gather dust, something else begins to rise, not immediately, but gradually, like a slow poisoning of the spirit. Nietzsche saw it before most dared to name it. He called it nihilism, and he feared it not because it was loud, but because it was quiet, subtle, like a shadow that spreads without form until everything it touches loses color, weight, and meaning. Nihilism is not just disbelief. It's disorientation. It's waking up in a world where love feels conditional, truth feels negotiable, and nothing, not morality, not beauty, not even suffering, seems to hold any lasting value. It begins with a question: why does any of this matter? And if the answer is unclear, the descent begins. For Nietzsche, this wasn't an abstract concern. He saw nihilism as the spiritual consequence of a culture that had outgrown its gods, but failed to replace them with anything else. And the danger wasn't just personal, it was civilizational. Without shared values, without a higher framework to tether the soul, people would drift toward extremes. Some would chase pleasure. Others would embrace ideology. Many would numb themselves through distraction. But all of them, in one way or another, would be running from the silence inside. Look around you. We live in Nietzsche's future. A world where entertainment is constant, yet boredom prevails. Where people curate images of joy, yet feel more alone than ever. Where faith in institutions, community, and even selfhood is eroding. Depression and anxiety are no longer anomalies. They are the background noise of an age unsure of what it believes. And it's not that we don't want meaning. We crave it, but we no longer know where to find it. Some turn to wealth, others to activism, still others to online identities that flicker with relevance but lack soul. We try to substitute what was lost with what is visible, measurable, instant. But the ache remains. Jung once wrote that all neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering. In a nihilistic age, we replace the hard path of self-confrontation with the easier path of avoidance. We distract ourselves, medicate ourselves, define ourselves by external signals, anything but face the terrible truth that we may have inherited a world with no built-in meaning. But Nietzsche did not tell us this to leave us in despair. He wasn't reveling in collapse. He was warning us because he believed something stronger could be born on the other side. The shadow of nihilism is real. But shadows, after all, only exist where there is light behind them. And that brings us to a painful but necessary question. What happens when we try to replace God not with something sacred but with something hollow? False gods and empty pleasures. When the sacred dies, the human psyche does not simply move on. It searches. It longs. And if it cannot find something higher, it will settle for something lesser. Nietzsche understood this with terrifying clarity. He knew that when God is gone, we don't enter a state of calm neutrality, we enter a vacuum. And nature, as the saying goes, abhors a vacuum. Something will fill the space. The only question is, what? Today, we have our new gods. They don't ask for worship through prayer, but through attention, through likes, through performance, through appearance. Social media becomes the new pulpit. Consumption becomes the new ritual. Wealth, fame, youth, these are our modern sanctities. And unlike the gods of old, these false idols never offer grace. Only hunger. You can give them everything and still feel empty. We no longer believe in divine reward, so we chase dopamine. We no longer fear eternal judgment, so we fear being irrelevant. In the absence of transcendence, we turn to the measurable, the visible, the instantly gratifying. And in doing so, we trade soul for stimulation. Meaning becomes marketing. Identity becomes brand. The self fragments under the pressure of performance. Nietzsche saw this danger long before Instagram. He predicted the rise of what he called last men people who would avoid pain, avoid conflict, avoid greatness in exchange for comfort and predictability. They would despise those who sought something more. They would mock passion, fear suffering, and live only to be entertained. And worst of all, they would call it happiness. Jung later expanded on this idea through the notion of the collective shadow. When a society refuses to confront its inner emptiness, it projects that darkness outward. We see it today in online outrage, culture wars, and endless polarization. These are not signs of strength, they are symptoms of meaning denied. Of people screaming, not because they know what they believe, but because they are terrified of believing nothing at all. But these false gods cannot satisfy. They seduce the ego but starve the soul. They distract us from the abyss but do not remove it. Sooner or later, the silence returns. The late-night question no one can escape, is this all there is? Nietzsche wasn't against pleasure, or beauty, or even success. But he warned, if you build your life on illusions, you will eventually collapse under their weight. And if you try to replace the sacred with the superficial, you will suffer not just loneliness, but spiritual disintegration. Which leads us to a deeper mystery. Why did Nietzsche see all this so clearly? What pain gave birth to his vision? And why, in the end, did he suffer alone? Nietzsche's personal agony. It's easy to quote Nietzsche, to turn his words into posters or slogans. God is dead. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. But what's harder, what few are willing to face, is the man behind the voice. Because Nietzsche's brilliance did not emerge from comfort. It rose from agony. He did not write his truths from a place of security. He wrote them from exile, from the psychological wilderness where no one could follow. He was born frail, plagued by migraines, near blindness, digestive illness. A man constantly in pain, walking for miles in solitude to find relief in movement. He lost his father at age 5, lost faith by 20, and by the time he reached his intellectual peak, he had already lost most of his friends. Not because he was cruel, but because he saw too far. He spoke of things others weren't ready to hear. About the death of morality. About the failure of philosophy. About the psychological fragility hidden beneath the surface of modern civilization. Nietzsche wasn't mad when he wrote his greatest works. He became mad because no one truly heard them. He was Cassandra in reverse a man, not a myth cursed to see the future, but dismissed as unwell, unsound, unstable. And when the world turned away, he fell into silence. For the last 11 years of his life, Nietzsche said nothing. His mind collapsed under the weight of his vision. His final words, allegedly spoken before the breakdown, were to a horse being whipped in the street. He ran to it, embraced it, wept. That moment, strange and tragic, has become a symbol of something deeper. Not insanity, but unbearable empathy. The philosopher who could no longer separate suffering from awareness. The man who had looked too deeply into the abyss and saw the abyss looking back. And yet, in his silence, Nietzsche became prophetic. Because today, his words speak louder than ever. Not because the world is now wise enough to accept them, but because we are now desperate enough to need them. We are finally living in the future he feared, a world of freedom without grounding, pleasure without fulfillment, choice without clarity. Nietzsche lived the pain he wrote about. His solitude wasn't a pose, it was a sentence. He wasn't trying to destroy faith. He was trying to warn those who would lose it what must come next. He knew that when the old world collapses, the new one isn't born in celebration. It's born in mourning. And only those who can survive that mourning, who can look at the wreckage and not turn away, can begin the long road to something real. So now we face the same threshold Nietzsche once stood at. But unlike him, we are not alone. And the question before us is no longer what did he see? It's what are we willing to see? The abyss is inside us now. Stand still for a moment. No distractions. No music. No scrolling. Just you and the silence. How long can you bear it? 30 seconds? 1 minute? Now imagine that silence stretching on deeper, darker, becoming not just the absence of sound, but the absence of certainty. That is the abyss Nietzsche warned us about. And it's no longer philosophical. It's psychological. It's not outside us, it's inside. In Nietzsche's time, the old world had just begun to crack. People still went to church. Morality still echoed through public life. But the foundation was already eroding. Today, the collapse is complete. We are the generation born after the fall. We no longer inherit belief, we assemble it. We no longer receive identity, we manufacture it. And with that shift comes something no previous civilization has faced at this scale, the burden of choosing what used to be given. And we are not well. Anxiety is no longer an exception. It's a baseline. Depression touches millions. Loneliness is called an epidemic. And beneath it all, a quiet terror lurks. The fear that maybe nothing means anything. That no matter what we achieve or consume or post, the ache remains. The void does not go away. Psychologists call it an existential crisis. But Nietzsche called it the inevitable result of killing God without building something greater. It's not that we lost the idea of God. It's that we lost the structure of meaning that once came with him, and we have not replaced it. Not truly. Instead, we chase substitutes. Algorithms feed us identities. Algorithms offer purpose. But the soul cannot be fed by data. And the abyss cannot be filled by distraction. You can see it in the extremes. The rise of fanaticism, political, religious, ideological, is not a sign of strength, but of desperation. People cling to absolutes because the alternative, living with ambiguity, is too frightening. But the truth Nietzsche offered is harder. There is no script waiting for you. No higher voice whispering your purpose. You must create it. From nothing. And that is the test of our time. Can we look into the abyss and not turn away? Can we accept that no one is coming to save us, not a God, not a system, not even a philosophy, and still choose to live with depth, with courage, with self-made meaning? This is where Nietzsche parts ways with despair. Because as much as he described the abyss, he never surrendered to it. He believed something greater could emerge, but only through transformation, through a new kind of human being. Not one who hides from the void, but one who walks into it and begins to build. And that's where we now turn to the figure Nietzsche believed could rise from the ruins. Not a tyrant, not a hero, but something far more difficult to become, the Übermensch. Becoming the Übermensch. When Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch, most people misunderstood him. They thought he meant superiority, a dominant figure, ruthless and towering above others. But that was never the point. The Übermensch, literally overman, is not a conqueror of people. He is a conqueror of meaninglessness. He is not driven by ego, but by transformation. He rises not by standing on others, but by rising above himself. In the ruins of the old world, Nietzsche saw a need for a new kind of being. One who would not cling to inherited truths. One who would not crumble under freedom. One who could stare into the abyss fully, without illusion, and still choose to create. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. The Übermensch is the person who becomes their own source of value, their own compass, their own reason to exist. Think of the artists, the visionaries, the ones who didn't wait for permission to be real. Leonardo da Vinci, Beethoven, Dostoevsky. Even in modern times, figures like Steve Jobs or Carl Jung, they didn't merely live in the world. They remade it, not through perfection, but through radical authenticity. They wrestled with chaos and carved meaning from it, not just for themselves, but for others. The Übermensch does not follow. He doesn't seek safety in systems, ideologies, or inherited beliefs. He is not against morality, but he refuses to be bound by rules that no longer reflect life. He doesn't seek comfort. He seeks alignment with the deepest parts of himself. He is forged in suffering, in solitude, in inner fire. But out of that fire, he brings something no god or scripture can give, self-created meaning. Jung would later echo this in his theory of individuation. He believed that the path to psychological wholeness was not through obedience, but integration. The confrontation with the shadow, the acceptance of one's darkness, the struggle to become not what the world expects, but what the soul demands. And that journey is neither linear nor gentle. It is a spiral descent into the unknown and a slow, courageous ascent into form. The Übermensch is not some mythic hero. He is the part of you that refuses to lie to yourself. The part that chooses growth over stagnation, truth over convenience, depth over distraction. He lives not for applause, but for integrity. And in a world addicted to masks, to surface, to validation, that kind of person is both dangerous and necessary. Nietzsche believed that only a few would dare attempt this. Most would fall into nihilism, into herd mentality, into artificial pleasures. But for those who had the strength not just of will, but of vision, there was another way. A higher path. One carved not by following signs, but by becoming the one who creates them. And yet, even the Übermensch must be driven by something. A force deeper than knowledge, more primal than belief. Nietzsche called it the will to power. And it is to that inner fire that we now turn. The will to power and self-creation. If the Übermensch is the destination, then the fuel that gets us there is what Nietzsche called the will power. And again, this idea is so often misunderstood. It is not about domination. It is not about crushing others underfoot. Nietzsche did not glorify tyranny, he despised it. The will to power he spoke of was not political. It was personal. It was psychological. It was the inner fire that refuses to be extinguished, even when the world offers no reason to keep going. At its core, the will to power is the drive to become, to transform suffering into strength, chaos into form, to stare into the formless void and instead of collapsing, to create. Every time you choose growth over comfort, honesty over denial, creation over consumption, you are enacting the will to power. It is the part of you that resists numbness, that pushes through pain, that says, even if the world has no meaning, I will make my own. Jung would later mirror this concept when he wrote about the individuation process, the journey through the unconscious, the shadow, the fragmentation of the self, until a more whole, more authentic self is born. He understood what Nietzsche did, that real transformation requires descent. You do not rise without first falling. You do not create yourself until you've torn down who you were told to be. In today's world, this idea could not be more urgent. We are told that happiness is the goal, that ease is the measure of success. But Nietzsche says, no. It is struggle that shapes us. It is resistance that refines us. The will to power is not about being fearless. It is about choosing courage despite fear. It is not about having control over others. It is about mastering the one person who truly matters, yourself. You exercise this will every time you stop waiting for someone to tell you what to do and start deciding for yourself. Every time you confront a painful truth instead of burying it. Every time you build something, an idea, a path, a life that did not exist before you. And most of all, when you stop seeking validation and begin to ask, what do I value, regardless of the world's opinion? Because that is the final evolution, to move from a creature that absorbs meaning to a creator who births it. To no longer live reactively, but intentionally, authentically, aligned. But this path is not for everyone. It demands more than intelligence, more than rebellion. It demands responsibility. And now, as we come to the end of this journey, the real question Nietzsche leaves us with is simple yet impossible to avoid. Will you rise or will you fall? Your abyss, your path. You've now stood at the edge of the abyss. You've looked down and seen what Nietzsche saw, not just the death of God, but the collapse of every structure that once made life feel stable. You've seen how modern life tries to fill that emptiness with noise, with pleasures, with distractions. And you've felt, maybe for the first time, that behind the chaos of our culture is a silence far more terrifying than any doctrine we've abandoned. But Nietzsche never wanted us to remain in that silence. He never wanted us to stay broken, faithless, paralyzed. His message, though dark, was never hopeless. God is dead was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a challenge, a calling to become something more than passive recipients of belief, to become creators, carvers of meaning, architects of soul. This is the real question of our time. Will you let the abyss consume you, or will you step into it and build? Because no one is coming to hand you a purpose. No one is coming to rescue you from the emptiness. And perhaps that's not a tragedy. Perhaps that's freedom in its purest, rawest form. A terrifying freedom, yes, but also a sacred one. Because it means the shape your life takes is entirely your own. You can choose to drift, to numb, to obey. Or you can choose to rise, to turn pain into depth, to face your own darkness, not to destroy it. That is the task of the Übermensch. Not a perfect being, but a person who refuses to live by lies, who builds, not from borrowed truths, but from the fire of inner clarity. And no, this path isn't easy. It will cost you comfort. It will strip away certainty. It will demand that you confront everything you once thought was fixed. But in exchange, it offers you something nothing else can. So now the question returns to you, quietly, like a whisper from the void. Will you choose to rise? Will you take responsibility for your beliefs, your values, your meaning? Or will you fall back into the waiting arms of distraction, noise, and numbness? Because God is dead is not just a statement about religion. It is a challenge, a mirror, a fire. And whether you see it as a warning or an invitation, that choice belongs to you alone.